This video was sponsored by Skillshare. Hey, happy Friday. This week we'll talk about Google getting a really important and really big fine in South Korea. We'll talk about the outcomes of the Epic versus Apple trial, and we'll also talk about Apple's really curious new iPad. We also have a tech knowledge quiz with 20 brand new questions to test yourself on. Links are in the description, and welcome to the Friday Checkout. Okay, this week we had an insane number of new releases, starting with the iPhone 13 series, 2 new iPads, and a new Apple Watch. And I think apart from the iPad mini, all of these are relatively minor, but nice year-over-year bumps, rather than anything revolutionarily new. Then Xiaomi announced 3 new phones in the 11 series, including one that charges at 120 watts, as well as officially bringing the Mi Pad 5 to Europe at a pretty insane 349 euros. GoPro announced their new Hero 10, where their trick is apparently a new chip that is supposedly way faster than anything GoPro had before. Marshall announced new Bluetooth earbuds that look like AirPods but with a really grunge Marshall skin on them. I kind of like the look. There were a bunch of other flagship announcements from smaller brands like Infinix as well, and HTC, funnily enough, also announced a tablet with a Unisoc chip for $275 in Russia. Oh, HTC, why are you even trying anymore? Just stop. Anyway, the gadget season is truly upon us, and to see all of the almost 100 new releases of the week, check out the Release Monitor and the Crowd app and upvote your favorites. Links are in the description. Okay, my first story of the week will be the South Korean Fair Trade Commission dishing out a new fine worth $177 million to Google, one of the largest fines of this sort in the country, and Google's second big regulatory loss in Korea just this month. So this new ruling specifically has a problem with Google pushing device makers like Samsung and LG to sign so-called anti-fragmentation agreements, which the regulator says hurts competition in the country. Now, these agreements are part of a big bundle of contracts that the device makers have to sign all together if they want to use any Google services on any of their phones at all. And this part in particular basically says that if the phone maker wants any Google, they're no longer allowed to make any non-Google Android forks at all. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but this basically puts companies into one of two camps. Either they're completely with Google or they're completely without Google, which of course is not a real choice for most large global device makers, so they just have to go with whatever Google gives them, and there's no opportunity for basically Android forks, dual booting devices, etc. And this limitation apparently not only blocks phone companies from making Android forks on phones, but also on other device types too. The first Samsung Gear smartwatch was running an Android fork, and then Google basically told them to stop, which is what caused Samsung to switch to Tizen instead. And LG too was apparently blocked from shipping a smart speaker with an Android fork on it as well. The Korean FTC has ruled that this practice has seriously hurt the competition. I think it's a really interesting comparison with the anti-competitive rules that the EU brought out a couple of years ago. The EU's complaint was that if a company wanted to ship the Play Store on their phones at all, they also had to ship a bunch of other stuff with it as well, such as Google as the default search engine and Chrome as the default browser, which, if you think about it, is just a different side of the same argument that the Koreans are making here. They are both saying that Google is using the Play Store as a sort of unfair leverage to force device makers to accept a bunch of conditions and requirements that hurt the competition, be it alternative search engines and web browsers in Europe, or devices running a version of Android that is not Google sanctioned in Korea. So Google will apparently have to drop these clauses from their agreement, at least in Korea, so we could theoretically start seeing companies like Samsung create their own Android forks and create their own versions of Android that are de-Googled, basically. Sounds like an interesting thing. I kind of understand where it's coming from. I'm not convinced that more fragmentation is what would make Android as a platform better, but we'll have to wait and see how this goes. Okay, and since we are apparently in regulation season, let's also talk about the Epic versus Apple case and all of its big outcomes as briefly and as compactly as we can. Now, Epic, if you don't remember, basically sued Apple for being anti-competitive by making 10 major claims to the judge, of which they lost 9 in this ruling. Pretty brutal. I'm going to be simplifying, but the main outcomes were that according to the judge, iOS does not have a monopoly power on mobile gaming, although it is not far off. And she also ruled that while not having any competing app store and competing in-app payment methods in iOS both allow Apple to have unreasonably high profit margins, basically neither is illegal according to her. Meaning that in her opinion, Apple was a big old meanie, but didn't really break any laws. Interestingly, that's contrary to the ruling from South Korea from like a week ago, where they recently said that not allowing alternative in-app purchase options was against the rules. Anyway, while in the US, Apple will neither have to allow alternative app stores nor alternative in-app payment methods built into the apps themselves, the US judge did agree with the Japanese FTC from last week that it was illegal of Apple to forbid their developers from telling their users that other payment methods even exist outside of the app. And Apple will at least have to allow that in the future, apparently. Although, since Apple already agreed to doing that after Japan's ruling last week, this isn't too much of a concession either. Even worse for Epic, the judge also ruled that Epic totally did very obviously break their developer contract with Apple when they secretly introduced their own payment processor through a hotfix into Fortnite on iOS. So not only will they have to pay a fine, Apple also doesn't have to let them back on the App Store if they don't want to. Ouch. In other words, Epic basically got a huge middle finger from the judge, and they are of course appealing this now, and the only real outcome for Apple is that they now have to allow their developers to tell their users that they can technically pay with other payment methods outside of the app. That's about it. Okay, and for the third story, I'd like to talk about the new iPad mini, and I'd actually like to hear your opinion on something in a little bit. So while most of the Apple announcements felt a little bit iterative this year, the new iPad mini certainly did not, as it got a huge upgrade after Apple basically abandoned this form factor for 6 full years. I think the Mini 4 from 2015 was the last device of this form factor from Apple, and Android device makers have kind of abandoned this sub 10-inch category completely as well. So Apple's big new push here is kind of a surprise for me. Especially given that they also surprisingly didn't position this as a cheap iPad that you'd put into like a hotel lobby or occasionally let your kids watch videos on, like most people would probably expect the mini model to be, I think, but instead they give it the latest Apple chip, the latest iPad design language with the smaller bezels, and support for Apple Pencils too. I thought we have kind of abandoned this form factor because we've realized that our phones have become big enough to not really need a small tablet, but then again here I am having spent way too much money on a phone that essentially unfolds to be practically the same size as an iPad mini, so maybe I'm wrong, and maybe Apple is onto something. And with tablets in general returning to some popularity and iPadOS maturing, there might just be enough people to make this category viable again as well, even if it is a small percentage of total sales. So I'd like to know if you are intrigued by this form factor. Yes, no, let me know down in the comments, and also let me know what you would actually use this for if you are. Of course, what you should use it for is learning a new creative skill on Skillshare, especially with that new Apple Pencil support. They have tons of classes for apps like Procreate that actually use those, or any other illustration software, or video editing, Photoshop, UI, UX design, you name it. Whatever creative skill you'd like to get better at, whether it is drawing a geometric cat in 4 styles in Adobe Illustrator, or making a kick-ass logo that actually looks unique and stands out, Skillshare is the right place to learn it. With thousands of high-quality classes from great industry leaders and working professionals, the platform is free of distractions and has millions of other students that you can discuss and share your learnings with. It's also really affordable at less than $10 a month, and the first 1,000 people to sign up using my link in the description get a 1-month free trial. So get creative, and I'll see you next Friday.